I woke up in my childhood bedroom, but the door was on the wrong wall. That's when I knew something had gone terribly wrong. The handle was brass instead of silver, the hinges faced inward when they should have been outward, and when I checked my phone for the time, it read 3:47 a.m. on a date I'd already lived through 3 days ago. My hands were shaking as I reached for the door, and the moment I touched that cold brass handle, I felt it, that sickening vertigo of reality, bending around me like wet paper, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was happening in this house wasn't bound by the rules I'd spent my entire life trusting. My name's Marcus, and I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that what happened to me in that house wasn't just scary. It was impossible in a way that breaks your brain when you try to explain it to yourself. I'd come back to my parents' place in rural Pennsylvania to help sort through some of my grandmother's belongings after she passed. She'd lived in the attached guest house for the last 15 years of her life, and my mom couldn't bring herself to go through Grandma's things alone. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. I'd driven up Friday evening, had dinner with my parents, and gone to bed around midnight in my old room, the same room I'd slept in from age 6 until I left for college. I knew that room better than anywhere else on earth. I'd memorized every crack in the ceiling, every squeak in the floorboards, the exact angle of afternoon sunlight through the window. But when I woke up at 3:47 a.m., everything was wrong in small ways that my brain kept trying to dismiss. The door on the wrong wall was just the beginning. My posters were there, the same bands and movies I'd loved as a teenager, but they were arranged in mirror image to how I'd had them. My bookshelf stood where my desk should have been. The closet door that had always stuck now swung open smoothly, while the window that had always opened easily wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I pushed. I stood in the center of that room for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, turning in slow circles, trying to understand what I was seeing. The logical part of my brain insisted I was confused, still half asleep. That memory plays tricks. But I wasn't confused. I knew I was right, and that certainty made everything so much worse. I opened the bedroom door, the one on the wrong wall, and stepped into a hallway that was simultaneously exactly like my parents' house and nothing like it at all. The family photos on the walls showed the right people, my parents, me, my sister, but we were wearing clothes I'd never seen before in locations I didn't recognize. In one photo, I was maybe 8 years old, standing in front of a lighthouse, smiling at the camera. And I have never been to a lighthouse in my life. I would have remembered. My mom was terrified of the ocean. We never took beach vacations. But there I was, clear as day, red jacket and wind-swept hair, and that gap-toothed smile I had before my adult teeth came in. The floorboards didn't creak in the right places as I walked down the hall. Every third step in the real house had always made this specific groan that sounded almost like a word, almost like help, drawn out long and low. My sister and I used to joke about it when we were kids, used to jump on that board just to hear it talk. But in this hallway, that board was silent, and a different board 7 steps down made a sound I'd never heard before, a sharp crack like breaking ice. I kept walking because I didn't know what else to do. The alternative was to stand frozen in that wrong hallway forever, and some part of me thought if I could just find my parents, just see them and talk to them, everything would snap back to normal. Their bedroom door was closed, just like always. They always slept with the door closed, because my dad was a light sleeper, and the cat liked to knock things over at night. I raised my hand to knock, and that's when I heard it, my own voice, coming from inside their room, having a conversation with my mother. I could hear myself talking about the drive up from Philadelphia, complaining about traffic on the turnpike, the exact conversation I'd had with my mom in the kitchen when I arrived Friday evening. But I was standing in the hallway. I was right here. I pressed my ear against the door, and the conversation continued. My voice and my mom's voice, laughing about something my dad had said at dinner, recounting the entire evening I'd just lived through. But it was happening now, in their bedroom, at 3:47 in the morning. I tried the doorknob, and it was locked, which was wrong, because they never locked their bedroom door. But when I put my hand on that knob, I felt it again, that sensation of reality warping, like the whole house took a breath and shifted 2 inches to the left while I stayed in place. The conversation inside the room stopped mid-sentence. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. Then my mother's voice, but not from inside the room anymore, from behind me, down at the end of hallway, called out, "Marcus, honey, is that you?" I spun around, and the hallway was different again, longer than it should have been, the walls a shade darker, the carpet a slightly different pattern. I could see my mom standing at the top of the stairs in her bathrobe, backlit by the kitchen light from downstairs, but something about her proportions seemed off, like she was the right height but too narrow, or maybe the doorway behind her was too wide. She started walking toward me, and I found myself backing away, not consciously deciding to move, just my body responding to some animal instinct that screamed danger. "What are you doing up, sweetheart?" she asked, and her voice was my mom's voice, the cadence and warmth exactly right. But underneath it I heard something else, some quality I can't describe except to say it sounded like her voice was being played on a tape that had been recorded over something darker. I stammered something about not feeling well, needing water, and she smiled at me with my mother's smile, but her eyes, I swear to you her eyes, didn't blink at the right intervals, too long between blinks. 5 or 6 seconds of unbroken stare before the lids finally came down. She told me to go back to bed, that she'd bring me some water, and she reached out to touch my shoulder. I don't know why I did it, but I jerked away from her hand, some instinct screaming at me not to let her make contact, and when I did, her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, and I saw something behind it. Something that wasn't my mother at all. Something that was trying so hard to hold the shape, but couldn't quite maintain it when surprised. I ran. I don't remember making the decision. I just remember suddenly I was running back toward my bedroom, and the hallway stretched as I ran, the door getting farther away instead of closer, and I could hear footsteps behind me. But they didn't sound like footsteps. They sounded like something heavy being dragged, a rhythmic scraping that kept pace with my sprint no matter how fast I moved. I reached the door, my bedroom door on the wrong wall, and threw myself inside and slammed it shut and locked it. And the moment that locked into place the dragging sounds, and the house went absolutely silent in a way that felt deliberate, like something was holding its breath. I stood with my back against the door, chest heaving, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe I'd never actually woken up. I'd read about sleep paralysis, about false awakenings, those dreams where you think you've woken up, but you're still asleep, layered dreams that feel absolutely real. That had to be it. I was still in bed, still asleep, and any minute now I'd actually wake up, and this would all be a weird story to tell over breakfast. I decided to test it, do the thing they always say to do in dreams, look at text, check a clock, try to count your fingers. I looked at my phone again, and the date had changed. It now read 5 days in the past, and the time was still 3:47 a.m., frozen there, the seconds not ticking over. That's when I noticed the notifications. Dozens of missed calls from my own number, text messages from myself, sent at 3:47 a.m. over and over again, all saying the same thing: don't go into the basement. She's not Mom. The door is a loop. Find the mirror. I stared at those messages until my eyes burned, trying to make them make sense. I hadn't sent them. I'd been asleep until a few minutes ago. But there they were, time stamped, in my messaging app, from my own contact. I scrolled back through my message history and found more, hundreds more. Same message repeated going back weeks, all sent at 3:47 a.m., all the exact same words. I should have stayed in that room. I should have climbed under the covers and squeezed my eyes shut and waited for morning, real morning. Whatever morning would mean in this version of the house. But the messages said to find the mirror, and I remembered my grandmother had this big antique mirror in her guest house, floor, length, ornate gold frame. Thing had been in our family for generations. She used to tell me stories about it when I was little, said it had come over from Poland with her grandmother, said it had special properties, though she'd never explained what she meant by that. I'd always assumed she was just making up fairy tales for a kid. Now I wasn't so sure. The door unlocked when I turned the deadbolt, but when I opened it, I wasn't looking at the hallway anymore. I was looking at a staircase I'd never seen before, narrow and steep, walls pressing in close, leading down into darkness. This wasn't the stairs to the main floor. This was something else, somewhere else. Behind me, my bedroom looked normal again. Everything in the right place. Door on the correct wall. Posters arranged how I remembered them. I could stay here, in this pocket of normalcy. But that felt like a trap, like if I retreated now, I'd be stuck in this room forever. Reality slowly dissolving around me, until there was nothing left but this 10 by 12 space, and whatever was pretending to be my mother waiting outside. I started down the stairs, and they went on much longer than they should have. At least 3 flights, which was impossible because my parents' house was only 2 stories and the foundation was a crawl space, not a basement. The air got colder as I descended and damp, and I started to smell something, earth and mildew, and something else, something organic and wrong, like meat left out too long. The stairs finally ended at a door, just a plain wooden door with a simple handle, and when I opened it I found myself in my grandmother's guest house, but not the version I'd seen Friday evening. This one was wrong in the same way the main house had been wrong. All the furniture rearranged in mirror image, her belongings sorted into boxes that hadn't been there before. The mirror stood against the far wall, covered with a white sheet. I knew it was the mirror, even though I couldn't see it, could feel it somehow, a weight in the room that pulled at my attention. I crossed the space, floorboards groaning under my feet with each step, and when I reached up to pull the sheet away, I hesitated, because I realized I was terrified of what I'd see in the reflection. Not a ghost, not a monster, but something worse, some version of this room, or this reality or myself that would confirm what I was starting to suspect, that I'd somehow slipped out of my real life into somewhere adjacent, somewhere that ran parallel, but off by degrees. I pulled the sheet down, and what I saw in that mirror broke something fundamental in my understanding of the world. The reflection showed my grandmother's guest house, but it was lived in, lights on. Grandmother herself sitting in her chair by the window, looking directly out of the mirror at me, except she'd been dead for 6 weeks. She looked exactly as I remembered her, small and bird, boned in her knit cardigan, reading glasses perched on her nose, and when she saw me she smiled with such warmth and sadness and gestured for me to come closer. I approached the mirror, and she stood from her chair and walked up to the glass from her side and placed her palm flat against it. "You slipped," she said, and I could hear her voice clearly, even though it should have been muffled by the glass, or impossible because she was a reflection, or non-existent because she was dead. "You slipped between, baby. The house does that sometimes, especially at 3D47. That's when the walls are thinnest. Your grandfather slipped once too, back in 1987. Took him 3 days to find his way back, and he was never quite the same after. You have to be careful now. This place, where you are, it's not just a copy of home. It's hungry. It wants to keep you. That thing that looks like your mother, it's the house trying to make you comfortable, trying to make you stay." I asked her how to get back, voice cracking with fear I could barely contain, and she told me the mirror was the way through. But only at the right time, only when the house took its breath. "You'll feel it," she said. "Everything will pause for just a moment, less than a second, and in that pause you have to step through. But Marcus, you have to be sure you're stepping through to the right side. There are other versions, dozens of them, houses that branched off at different points, different moments when reality fractured. Some of them are close to your real home, just slightly off. Some of them are very far away. You have to listen for the right one, feel for it. You'll know it by the weight of it, by how much it pulls at you." She started to say something else, but her image flickered, static cutting across her face like a bad TV signal. and behind her I could see the room changing, walls peeling, furniture aging decades in seconds, and her voice distorted, pitched lower and lower until it was just noise, just a rumble that vibrated in my chest. Then the mirror went dark, completely black, and I was looking at my own reflection again, but not quite my reflection. This version of me looked older, tired, with scars I didn't have, and an expression of absolute defeat. The reflection mouthed something at me, words I couldn't hear, and then it turned and walked away from the mirror, disappearing into darkness. I stood there staring at my own absence in that black glass for I don't know how long, trying to process what my grandmother had told me, trying to feel for this breath the house was supposed to take. Time felt strange, unmoored, like I could have been standing there for 5 minutes or 5 hours, and both would be equally true. Then I felt it, just like she'd described. Everything paused. The subtle sounds of the house settling ceased. The faint whistle of wind through window frames stopped. Even the ringing in my ears from the silence vanished, and in that pause the mirror rippled like water, and I saw light on the other side, warm yellow light like a lamp left on. I didn't think, I just moved, stepped forward through the mirror, and felt that same reality, warping sensation, like being pulled through something viscous and resistant, and I stumbled out onto hardwood floor in my grandmother's guest house, the real version, boxes stacked exactly where my mom and I had left them Friday evening, everything solid and correct and real in a way that almost made me cry with relief. I spun around to look at the mirror behind me, and it showed only a normal reflection, me in my pajamas looking disheveled and terrified in the dim light from the street lamp outside. I ran out of the guest house, across the small yard that connected it to the main house, and burst through the kitchen door into warmth and the smell of coffee and my mother, my actual mother, standing at the counter in her bathrobe looking startled. "Marcus, what on earth? What are you doing outside? It's 6 in the morning." I looked at the kitchen clock, and it read 6:15 a.m. Saturday morning, exactly when it should be, and I started laughing, half hysterical with relief, and told her I'd had a nightmare. Went outside for air, couldn't sleep. She made me breakfast, and I sat at that kitchen table, and everything was right, the chairs in the correct positions, the family photos showing memories. I actually had the floorboards creaking in all the familiar places. But here's what I can't stop thinking about. What keeps me awake now when I try to sleep? When I looked at my phone that morning, really looked at it, the messages were still there, hundreds of them from my own number, all saying, "Don't go into the basement. She's not Mom. The door is a loop. Find the mirror." And when I checked my call history, I found something that made my blood run cold. There were outgoing calls logged to my own number, dozens of them, all placed at 3,047 a.m. over the past 6 weeks, since the night my grandmother died. I never made those calls. I never sent those messages. But some version of me did, some version that slipped between and didn't make it back, or made it back wrong, or is still there in one of those branching houses, trying to warn the others. I left my parents' house that afternoon, told them I had work stuff come up, couldn't stay to help with Grandma's belongings after all. My mom was disappointed but understanding. I haven't been back since. I can't. Because the worst part, the part I haven't told anyone until now, is that sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment in Philadelphia, I'll wake up and small things will be wrong. A book on a different shelf. My bathroom mirror reflecting an angle that doesn't quite match the room. The lock on my door turning from the inside out, and I'll check my phone and it will be 3:47 a.m. exactly, and I'll wonder if I really made it back that morning, or if I'm still slipping, still moving between versions of my life, getting further from the real one with each shift. And maybe one night I'll wake up in a version so far removed that I won't even remember. There was ever a version where things were right. The thing about reality is you trust it without thinking, the same way you trust the ground to be solid beneath your feet. You don't question that your front door opens to the same hallway every time, that your face in the mirror is your face, that the people in your life are the people they've always been. But once that trust breaks, once you've seen it bend and crack, you can't ever fully believe in it again. Every moment becomes suspect. Every familiar thing carries the possibility of wrongness. And that's a special kind of horror, one that doesn't end when the sun comes up, one that follows you into every room and every reflection and every 3:47 a.m. for the rest of your life. Sarah Chen's life changed on a Tuesday afternoon in September when she realized she'd been having the same conversation with her co-worker for the third time. Not a similar conversation, the exact same one, word for word, his inflection and pauses identical, her responses the same each time, like a scene from a movie replaying. She was standing by the copy machine in her office building, watching paper feed through the tray, and Derek from accounting walked up and said, "Hey, Sarah, did you catch the game last night?" And they had a 45-second exchange about baseball, a sport she didn't even follow. And when it ended, Derek walked away, and Sarah went back to her desk. 20 minutes later, Derek approached the copy machine again while she was there, said the exact same words in the exact same tone, and they had the identical conversation, her mouth forming responses she'd already given, like her body was on autopilot. The first time she dismissed it as coincidence, weird but explainable. The second time she paid attention, really focused on what was happening, and when Derek said, "Those seventh-inning runs were clutch," for the second time, she tried to say something different, tried to break the pattern. But the words that came out of her mouth were the same ones from before. Yeah, totally changed the momentum, even though she was actively trying to say. This conversation already happened. It was like being trapped in her own body, conscious but not in control, a passenger watching herself perform a script. The third time it happened, an hour after the second, she started to panic because Derek didn't seem to notice anything strange. He was just living his Tuesday afternoon, having what he thought was a first-time conversation about baseball, completely unaware that they'd already done this twice. Sarah tried to tell herself she was stressed, overworked, maybe experiencing some weird neurological glitch, a seizure or a stroke that was making her perceive false memories. She looked up temporal lobe epilepsy on her phone, read about DAJ view and Jamay's view and confabulation, all the ways the brain can malfunction and create false patterns. But she knew that, wasn't it? Knew with absolute certainty that those conversations had happened exactly as she remembered, because the third time she'd tested it, had Derek's words memorized, mouthed them along with him as he said them, and every single syllable matched. This wasn't her brain misfiring. This was something else, something happening to time itself around her, or to the world, or to whatever thin membrane separated one moment from another. She left work early, told her manager she felt sick, which was true in the sense that reality breaking tends to make your stomach turn and your hands shake. She drove home on autopilot, barely registering traffic or stoplights, pulled into her apartment complex parking lot, and sat in her car for 10 minutes trying to calm down, trying to think rationally about what was happening. Then she looked up and saw herself walking into the building, saw her own back, her own jacket and bag and gait, watched herself disappear through the lobby door. She checked the rearview mirror, and she was still sitting in the driver's seat, still gripping the steering wheel, which meant the person who'd just walked into the building was also her, another her, a version that existed simultaneously. Sarah got out of the car on legs that felt disconnected from her body and walked slowly toward the lobby, every instinct screaming at her to get back in the car and drive anywhere else. But she couldn't. She had to know, had to see how far this impossibility went. The lobby was empty. She took the elevator to the 4th floor, walked down the hall to her apartment, and stood outside her own door listening. She could hear movement inside, the familiar sounds of someone coming home, bag dropping on the counter, keys in the dish, water running in the kitchen. Someone was in her apartment, and that someone was her, and she was also standing in the hallway. Two versions existing in the same timeline, the same physical space, just separated by a door and a few feet of reality that apparently didn't work the way she'd always believed. She tried her key in the lock, and it turned smoothly, and when she opened the door, she saw her apartment empty, no one home, no bag on the counter, no keys in the dish, everything exactly as she'd left it that morning. But she'd heard someone inside just seconds ago, clear as anything. She stepped inside and closed the door, and that's when she felt it, the same sensation Marcus had described, though she had no way of knowing about his experience. That feeling of the world hiccuping, reality taking a breath and shifting slightly out of phase. The apartment flickered, just for a fraction of a second, and suddenly the bag was on the counter. The keys were in the dish, and she could hear the shower running in the bathroom. She walked slowly toward the bathroom, heart hammering so hard she thought she might pass out, and pushed open the door. The shower was running, steam filling the small space, but the stall was empty, water pouring down on nothing. She reached in and turned off the tap, and the steam began to clear, and when she looked at the bathroom mirror, she saw herself standing there, but the reflection was off by maybe 2 seconds, moving just slightly delayed, like watching a video stream with lag. Her reflection raised its hand to touch the mirror, and Sarah hadn't moved her hand yet. And when she did move it, when she raised her palm to meet the reflection, her hand touched glass, but the reflection's hand passed through, phased through the surface like it wasn't there at all. The reflection's mouth moved, forming words Sarah couldn't hear, and she leaned closer, trying to read the lips. And that's when she saw that behind her reflection, in the mirror's version of the bathroom, there were other reflections, dozens of them, all Sarah, all wearing different clothes, different expressions, all moving independently, living out different versions of this moment. Some looked terrified like she felt, some looked resigned, some looked angry, and one, standing at the very back of the crowd, looked directly at her with an expression of such profound sadness that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, without understanding why. She stumbled backward out of the bathroom, and the world flickered again, harder this time, and when her vision cleared, she was standing in her kitchen, and it was dark outside even though it had been afternoon moments ago, and there was food cooking on the stove she didn't remember preparing, and sitting at her small dining table was another her, this one older by maybe a decade, with shorter hair and laugh lines around her eyes, and the older version looked up from the book she was reading and said, "You're early. It usually takes until the bedroom mirror before you slip through this far." Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't process what she was seeing, and the older version set down her book with a sigh and said, "Sit down before you fall down. I know this is overwhelming. I remember being you, remember this exact moment. You want answers, and I'll give them to you, but you're not going to like them, because the truth is, there is no going back. Once you start slipping between the versions, once you become aware of the branches, the timeline can't hold you anymore. You become unstuck, quantum, existing in superposition. Schrödinger's Sarah, alive in infinite variations simultaneously. The older Sarah explained that it had started for her, for the original her, for all the hers, with the time loops at work, the repeated conversation with Derek. That was always the first sign, when time started to stutter and repeat, when the fabric of linear causality began to fray around you specifically. It meant you'd somehow become entangled with probability itself, with every decision point that branched reality into different paths. Most people live their entire lives in one branch, completely unaware that with every choice, every coin flip, every moment of true randomness, the universe split, and other versions of them lived out the alternative in parallel timelines. But sometimes, rarely, someone became aware, and that awareness was like a beacon. It drew the other timelines into phase coherence, made the walls between branches permeable. "Why me?" Sarah asked, finding her voice finally, and the older version smiled sadly and said, "Why any of us? Maybe we're just naturally quantum, some quirk of neurology or genetics or soul, if that's even a real thing. Maybe we made a choice at some pivotal moment that was so perfectly balanced, so exactly 50-50 probability, that we split down the middle and both versions stayed conscious of each other. I've spent years trying to figure it out, jumping between branches, talking to other versions of us, and no one knows for sure. What I do know is once it starts, it accelerates. The slips will get more frequent, the boundaries thinner. You'll start to lose track of which branch you originated from, which life is yours, which memories belong to which version. Sarah felt the panic rising in her chest again and asked if there was a way to stop it, to anchor herself back in one timeline. And the older version hesitated before answering. There are ways to slow it down. Stabilize yourself in a single branch for longer periods. Routine helps, paradoxically. If you do the exact same things at the exact same times every day, it creates a kind of groove in probability, makes your path deeper and harder to slip out of. Avoid mirrors when possible. They act as bridges between branches. Don't dwell on alternate choices, on roads not taken. That kind of thinking makes the boundaries weak. And whatever you do, don't try to find the original timeline, the first branch you came from, because that's a trap that will drive you insane. She asked why. Why searching for the original would be dangerous, and the older version's face darkened, and she said, because there might not be one. Or there might be dozens, each one claiming to be first, each one with equal validity. I've met versions of us who've been slipping for 30 years, who can't remember a time when they weren't quantum, who have memories of childhoods in different families, different countries, different decades. Reality isn't a line, Sarah. It's not even a tree with branches. It's an infinite web, every moment connected to every other moment, and we're stuck in the middle, conscious of too many threads, pulled in all directions at once. The kitchen flickered again, and suddenly Sarah was alone, the older version gone, the apartment back to daylight, and she was standing by the stove. But there was no food cooking, and when she checked her phone it was 4:47 p.m., exactly 1 hour later than the last time she'd checked. But she had no memory of the past hour, just a gap, missing time. She opened her recent apps and found her notes app open to a new entry she didn't remember writing. It said, "You were with the older version for 37 minutes. She told you everything you needed to hear. You won't remember the full conversation, but you'll remember the important parts. The slipping is real. It's permanent. Learn to stabilize or lose yourself completely. Trust the routine. Fear the mirrors. Don't search for origin. This note will disappear when you slip again. Read it as many times as you need to." Sarah read that note 17 times, tried to screenshot it, but the screenshot came out blank, tried to photograph it with another phone, but the camera wouldn't focus. The text blurred no matter what she did. She understood then that information itself was quantum. When you were slipping, some things could cross between branches and some couldn't, and knowledge about the slipping was apparently the kind that stayed isolated to individual timelines, had to be relearned each time. She started writing everything down on paper, filled a journal with observations about when the slips happened. What triggered them? How to recognize which branch she was in by small details, her apartment building's subtle differences, variations in her belongings, different photos on her phone. The routine helped like the older version had said. Sarah built her life into a rigid structure, woke at the same time, ate the same breakfast, took the same route to work, responded to emails in the same order, had lunch at the same hour, everything scheduled and controlled and repetitive. It created a stability, a weight in one particular timeline that made her harder to dislodge. She could go days, sometimes a week, without slipping, but it was exhausting, living like a machine, and she was so lonely. Because how do you maintain relationships when you're never sure if you're talking to the same version of a person you talked to yesterday? When you can't be certain your friends and family remember the same shared history you do. She started testing people, asking them about specific events, looking for inconsistencies in their memories that would tell her. She'd slipped into a different branch. Her parents had the wrong story about her college graduation. Her best friend didn't remember a trip they'd taken to Portland. Her sister referenced a boyfriend Sarah had never met. Each inconsistency was a marker, a signpost telling her how far from her origin point she'd drifted. She made a spreadsheet, tried to track the branches, map out which versions connected to which, and the pattern that emerged was terrifying in its complexity. Timelines splitting and merging and splitting again. Some branches so close to others they were nearly identical. Some wildly divergent, and she was drifting through all of them, a ghost haunting infinite versions of her own life. The mirrors became her worst enemy and her only reliable constant. Every mirror was a doorway she'd learned, but also a window, and if you knew how to look, really look, you could see the other branches reflected in the glass, other versions of the room and other versions of yourself moving through their own timelines. She started covering every mirror in her apartment with sheets, but that made things worse somehow, made the boundaries more unstable, like the act of hiding from the truth weakened her anchor. So she forced herself to look, to confront the reflections, to acknowledge the other Sarahs and accept that they were all equally real, all equally her. One night, 3 months after it started, she had a slip so severe it sent her cascading through dozens of branches in rapid succession. She'd broken her routine, stayed late at work, taken a different route home. Allowed herself to think about all the choices that had led her to this moment. Wonder what her life would have been like if she'd taken that job in Boston. If she'd said yes to David's proposal, if she'd gone to art school instead of business school. And the wondering was like pulling a thread. Reality unraveled around her, and she found herself jumping, kitchen to bedroom to car to office to coffee shop to park. Each location a different branch. Each version of herself living out a different choice, and she could feel herself fragmenting. Her identity dissolving into the collective, Sarah Chen becoming less a person and more a probability cloud. She ended up in a version of her apartment she didn't recognize, everything slightly wrong, walls a different color, furniture she'd never owned, photos of people she'd never met. She collapsed on the couch, which felt real enough, solid enough, and tried to ground herself, remember who she was, where she'd come from, what was true about her life. But the memories wouldn't settle. They kept shifting, overlapping, contradicting. She remembered being married and being single. She remembered having a daughter and being childless. She remembered her mother being alive and attending her funeral. All versions equally vivid, equally real, and no way to know which memories belonged to this branch, which Sarah she was supposed to be right now. The front door opened, and a man walked in, tall and kind-faced, carrying groceries, and when he saw her on the couch he smiled and said, "Hey, babe, you're home early?" And Sarah had never seen this man before in her life, but also she loved him, had loved him for 6 years, married him in a ceremony on a beach in California, could remember the vows they'd written, the song they'd danced to, the way he looked at her like she was the only real thing in his world. Both truths existed in her mind simultaneously, stranger and husband, and she didn't know which to trust. She asked him his name, testing, and he laughed like she was joking and said, "Very funny, Sarah. Bad day at work." And she realized this branch's version of her had a life Sarah didn't remember living, had made different choices, followed a different path, and she was inhabiting that version's existence, like wearing someone else's clothes. She stood up and walked to the bathroom, needed to see herself, ground herself in something concrete, and when she looked in the mirror, she saw a version of herself that was different, subtly, but definitely different, hair longer, a small scar on her chin she'd never had, and behind her reflection were all the others, all the Sarahs, looking back at her with expressions ranging from pity to fear to exhaustion. The version of Sarah that lived in this apartment, that was married to the kind-faced man that had lived a life Sarah didn't remember. Was she gone now, displaced, pushed out of her own timeline by Sarah's slip? Or were they merging, both consciousness occupying the same body, splitting the difference between two sets of memories? Sarah touched the mirror and felt that familiar sensation of reality bending, and she understood with sudden clarity that this was the endgame. This was where the slipping led, to a complete dissolution of individual identity, to becoming a superposition of all possible Sarahs. Every choice and every path and every moment collapsed into one quantum entity that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, everyone and no one. She pulled her hand back from the mirror, and the kind-faced man appeared in the doorway behind her, reflected in the glass, and he looked concerned and asked if she was okay, and Sarah turned to face him and said, "I don't belong here. I'm not your Sarah. I slipped from another branch, and I don't know how to get back." And she watched his expression change from concern to confusion to fear, as he processed what she was saying, as he decided whether to believe her or to be scared of her. And she saw the moment he chose not to engage, chose to treat it as a joke or a breakdown, some mental health crisis that could be managed, and she realized that was the loneliest part of all this, that even if she told the truth, even if she explained what was happening, no one could really understand, no one could follow her into the quantum space where she existed. She left that apartment, walked out past the confused man who was and wasn't her husband, and stood on the street as night settled over a city that might or might not be the same city she'd lived in that morning. She thought about the older version's warning about not searching for the original timeline, but what else was there to do except this drift, this endless falling through infinite versions of a life that grew less recognizable with each slip. She refused to believe that was the only option, refused to accept that she was doomed to dissolve into probability. If she'd become quantum, if she existed in superposition, then that meant she was connected to all the branches simultaneously, and if that was true, there had to be a way to choose, to collapse the wave function, to decide which Sarah she wanted to be and anchor herself there permanently. She started walking, not sure where she was going, letting her feet decide, and the city flickered around her as she moved, buildings changing height and style, streets rerouting, people phasing in and out of existence. She walked for hours or maybe minutes. Time had stopped meaning anything, and eventually she found herself standing in front of a building she recognized, a therapy office. She'd visited in some branches, never visited in others, and on the door was a sign that said, Dr. Elizabeth Mora, quantum psychology specialist. Sarah almost laughed, because quantum psychology wasn't a real field, couldn't be a real field, but she opened the door anyway, because nothing was real anymore, so why not this? The waiting room was empty, and the receptionist's desk was unmanned, but a door at the back stood open, and a woman's voice called out, "Come in, Sarah. I've been expecting you, though I suppose I always am in some branch or another." Sarah walked into the office and found a woman in her 60s, grey hair pulled back, wearing practical clothes and a warm expression, and Dr. Mora gestured to a chair and said, "You're slipping, obviously. Severely, from the look of you. How long since you could reliably identify your origin branch?" And Sarah started to cry, because finally, someone who understood, someone who didn't look at her like she was crazy or broken, someone who treated the impossible as routine. Dr. Mora explained that she'd been studying quantum consciousness for 40 years. Ever since she'd had her own slipping crisis in her 20s, and while she'd never found a way to completely stop it, she'd developed techniques to manage it, to maintain coherence across branches, to keep a stable sense of self even while drifting between timelines. The key was accepting that there was no one true Sarah, no original version to get back to, because identity itself was quantum. Consciousness was probability distribution, and the self was never a fixed point, but always a range of potential states that reality kept collapsing into different configurations. "You're not losing yourself," Dr. Mora said. "You're expanding yourself. You're becoming aware of your full probability space. Most people only ever experience one collapsed state, one path, and they think that's who they are. But you get to see all the versions, all the choices, all the paths simultaneously. It's terrifying, yes, but it's also a kind of liberation if you can learn to hold it all without fragmenting." She taught Sarah meditation techniques, visualization exercises, ways to think about identity that were fluid enough to accommodate multiple timelines, but structured enough to maintain coherence. She gave Sarah homework, assigned her to write letters to her other selves, to acknowledge and integrate the different versions rather than fighting against them. Sarah left that office feeling something close to hope for the first time in months, and when she stepped out onto the street the city had stabilized around her, buildings solid, timeline holding steady. She pulled out her phone, and it showed her photos from multiple branches, her gallery a chaotic mix of life paths, and she scrolled through looking at all the different Sarahs, all the different choices, and instead of feeling lost, she felt connected, woven into a larger pattern that was too complex to understand, but beautiful in its infinite variation. She opened her notes app and started writing, not trying to track branches anymore, but just documenting this moment, this feeling, this version of Sarah who had learned to slip without drowning, who had found a way to be quantum and coherent simultaneously. The note would disappear next time she slipped. She knew that, but maybe some future Sarah would find an echo of it, a probability ghost, and know that someone had figured out how to survive this. Someone had found a way to be lost and found at the same time. The thing about quantum reality is that observation collapses the wave function, forces probability to commit to a single state. But what Sarah learned is that if you're the one observing and you're quantum yourself, the rules change. You don't collapse into one state. You exist in controlled superposition, present in multiple timelines, but maintaining a coherent identity across all of them. It's not the same as being stuck in one branch, living one life. It's bigger than that, stranger than that, and yes, lonelier than that, because you carry all the weight of all the choices all the time. But there's a freedom in it, too, in knowing that every possibility is real somewhere, that every version of you is living out their truth in some branch of the infinite tree. Sarah Chen walks through a city that's always changing, lives in an apartment that's never quite the same twice, loves people who may or may not remember her tomorrow. And she's learning to be okay with that, learning to find the poetry in probability, the beauty in uncertainty, the strange gift of being unstuck in time. James Whitmore bought the house on Maple Street in the spring of 2019, a modest two-bedroom colonial in a quiet Connecticut suburb, the kind of place where people walked their dogs at dawn and waved to neighbors across perfectly maintained lawns. He'd gotten a good deal on it below market value because the previous owner had died in the house, and apparently that spooked enough potential buyers to drive the price down. James didn't believe in ghosts, didn't put stock in superstition, saw death as a natural process with no supernatural component. An elderly man had passed away peacefully in his sleep upstairs, the realtor had explained. Estate sale, everything cleaned and cleared, completely ready for move-in. James had signed the papers without hesitation, glad for the discount, looking forward to finally having a place of his own after years of renting apartments in the city. The first few weeks were normal, unremarkably normal, the kind of normal that in retrospect feels suspicious, but at the time just feels like life. James unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, painted the spare bedroom a light blue, set up his home office, established routines. He worked from home as a software engineer, video calls and code reviews, and long stretches of focused debugging, his days structured around stand-ups and sprint planning and the familiar rhythms of remote work. The house was quiet, perfectly quiet, which he appreciated after years of thin, walled apartments where he could hear neighbors, fighting and footsteps overhead and bass thumping through walls at 2 a.m. Here he had silence, stillness, just the ambient sounds of an old house settling, pipes expanding and contracting, the furnace cycling on and off. But there were small things, details that accumulated slowly enough that he didn't notice a pattern until later, until it was too late to walk away. He'd come downstairs in the morning and find cabinet doors open that he was certain he'd closed the night before. Not all of them, just one or two, random selection, kitchen one day, bathroom the next. He'd chalked it up to old hardware, weak magnetic catches, doors drifting open on their own, due to house settling or air pressure differentials. Then it was lights. He'd turn off every light before bed, triple-checking each room, because he hated wasting electricity, and he'd wake up to find the hallway light on, or the basement light, or the lamp in the living room. He considered electrical problems, faulty switches, but when he tested them, everything worked perfectly. Lights stayed off when he turned them off during the day. Only at night did they develop this tendency to turn themselves back on. He started noticing cold spots, specific locations in the house where the temperature dropped noticeably, maybe 10 or 15 degrees colder than the surrounding space, usually in doorways or at the top of the stairs. He'd walk through them and feel the chill prickle his skin, raise the hair on his arms, and he'd check the thermostat and the heating vents and couldn't find any logical reason for these isolated pockets of cold. He bought a temperature gun, one of those infrared thermometers, and confirmed it objectively. 47 degrees in the doorway to the spare bedroom, while the hallway on either side read 68. He researched house insulation, checked for drafts around windows and doors, sealed every gap he could find. But the cold spots persisted, unmoved by his efforts, fixed in place like permanent features of the house's architecture. The dreams started in the second month, vivid and recurring, always the same sequence. He'd be lying in bed, in the dream, in the exact position he'd fallen asleep in, and he'd hear footsteps downstairs, slow and deliberate. Someone walking from the kitchen through the dining room into the living room. He'd know he was alone in the house, know he'd locked all the doors, but the footsteps continued unhurried, and he'd feel paralyzed, unable to move or call out, just lying there listening as the steps reached the stairs and began climbing, each creak of the old wood perfectly timed, ascending toward the second floor. The footsteps would reach the landing, pause for a moment, then continue down the hall toward his bedroom. And just as they reached his door, just as the handle started to turn, he'd wake up gasping, heart racing, drenched in sweat. The dream felt too real, too tactile, not like normal dreams which had a fluid quality, scenes shifting and logic bending. This was concrete, sensory. He could feel the sheets under his hands, smell the familiar scent of his laundry detergent, hear the specific acoustics of his house at night. After the fourth or fifth time, he started to dread going to sleep, would stay up late scrolling through his phone, watching shows, anything to delay that moment of closing his eyes and potentially triggering the dream. He started sleeping with lights on, with music playing, with the TV on low volume, anything to change the conditions, break the pattern. But the dream adapted, incorporated the light and sound into its narrative. The footsteps now visible as shadows passing under the door, the music unable to mask the sound of each ascending step. Then came the night when it wasn't a dream. James woke to the sound of footsteps downstairs, the exact same pattern as always, kitchen to dining room to living room, and he was awake, definitely awake. He'd pinched himself and checked his phone, and the time was 3:47 a.m., and he was not dreaming. He lay perfectly still, listening, every muscle tense, as the footsteps reached the stairs and began to climb. He reached slowly for his phone, unlocked it, opened the dial pad, ready to call 911, and that's when the footsteps stopped. Complete silence, so absolute it felt like the world had been put on mute. He waited, phone in hand, barely breathing, and after maybe 30 seconds the footsteps resumed. But now they were going back down, descending the stairs, retracing the path, kitchen to living room to dining room to kitchen, and then silence again. James sat up, turned on every light in the bedroom, and waited for dawn. When the sun finally came up, he went downstairs and checked every door, every window, every possible entry point. Everything was locked from the inside, no signs of forced entry, no footprints or disturbances, nothing out of place. He checked for animals in the walls, thought maybe raccoons or squirrels could create sounds that mimicked footsteps, but found no evidence of pests, no droppings or nests or damage to the attic insulation. He called a pest control service anyway, had them do a full inspection, and they confirmed the house was clean, no animals, no explanation for nocturnal sounds. The footsteps came back 3 nights later, same pattern, same timing, 3:47 a.m. exactly. This time James got out of bed, grabbed a baseball bat from the closet, and opened his bedroom door, just as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. The hallway was empty, completely empty, but the footsteps continued, passed right by him. Close enough that he should have been able to see whoever was making them. He watched the hallway carpet depress slightly as the invisible presence moved past him, small indentations appearing and disappearing in sequence, the pattern of someone walking, and he backed into his room and slammed the door and shoved his dresser in front of it, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, he started researching the house's history, something he should have done before buying, but hadn't because he didn't believe in hauntings, and didn't think past deaths were relevant to present value. He found the obituary for the previous owner, Harold Marsh, age 79, survived by no one, no children or siblings or surviving spouse mentioned, just a brief notice that he'd passed peacefully at home. James dug deeper, found property records going back decades, and discovered that Harold had lived in the house for over 40 years, since the early 1980s, and before that it had been owned by a family named Patterson. He found a newspaper article from 1978 about a break-in at the Patterson house. Intruder had entered during the night. Mrs. Patterson had woken to sounds downstairs, woken her husband. Mr. Patterson had gone to investigate and been shot, died on the scene. Intruder never caught. The footsteps matched the timeline, James realized. Kitchen to living room to stairs, ascending, the exact path an intruder would take, and the timing, 3:47 a.m., that could have been when it happened, when Mr. Patterson died. James felt his skin crawl as the pattern snapped into focus. This wasn't random haunting. This was a traumatic event replaying itself, burned into the house like a recording, playing back every few nights at the exact moment it had happened decades ago. He was listening to a murder, or the prelude to one, the last sounds Mr. Patterson heard before his life ended. He considered moving out, breaking his lease with himself, taking the financial hit and finding somewhere else to live. But that felt like admitting defeat, letting fear dictate his choices, and besides, the footsteps hadn't actually hurt him, hadn't even acknowledged his presence. They were just sounds, residual energy, a tape loop playing in the background of his life. He decided he could live with it, learn to ignore it the way you ignore traffic noise or a ticking clock. Just another feature of the house, ambient sound that would fade into the background with enough exposure. That strategy worked for about 2 weeks. The footsteps came regularly, every 2 or 3 nights, always the same time, same pattern, and James trained himself not to react, to roll over and go back to sleep, treat it like a noisy neighbor or a barking dog, just part of the environment. But then things escalated. The haunting evolved beyond simple replay. He woke one night to find a man standing at the foot of his bed, elderly, gaunt, wearing pajamas that looked 30 years out of date. The figure was translucent but clearly visible, detailed enough that James could see the liver spots on his hands, the deep lines around his mouth, the particular way his thin hair was combed to the side. They made eye contact, James and the apparition, and the old man's expression was one of profound confusion, like he didn't understand where he was or why this stranger was sleeping in his bedroom. James opened his mouth to scream or speak or something, but no sound came out. His voice locked in his throat, and the figure tilted its head slightly, studying James with that confused expression, and then raised one translucent hand and pointed toward the door. The gesture was insistent, urgent, not threatening but demanding, and James found himself getting out of bed, not consciously choosing to move, but compelled somehow, and he walked toward the door with the apparition following, pointing, guiding him. They went down the hall to the spare bedroom, the one James had painted blue and set up as a home office, and the figure pointed at the closet. James opened the closet door and at first saw nothing unusual, just boxes of old files, office supplies, the clutter he hadn't yet found permanent places for. But the apparition kept pointing, gesturing more frantically, and James started moving boxes out of the closet, stacking them in the room, and behind them, attached to the back wall of the closet, he found a small door, maybe 2 feet square, painted to match the wall and nearly invisible. He pulled it open and found a crawl space, and inside the crawl space was a metal box, lockbox, the kind you'd use for important documents or valuables. He pulled the box out, and the apparition immediately became more agitated, gesturing frantically at the box, then at James, then back at the box, and James understood he was meant to open it. The lock was old but simple, and James went to the garage and got bolt cutters and forced it open and inside he found papers, documents, and a revolver. The papers were organized carefully: birth certificates, a marriage license, photographs, and letters, lots of letters, correspondence between Harold Marsh and someone named Catherine, decades of letters, declarations of love and regret and longing. The photographs showed a younger Harold with a beautiful woman, both smiling, clearly in love, and James started reading the letters and pieced together a story. Catherine had been Harold's wife, married in 1979, just a year after the Patterson murder. They'd bought this house together, built a life here, but Catherine had died young, mid-40s, cancer, and Harold had never recovered. Had lived alone in this house for another 30 years, keeping her memory alive through these letters and photographs. The gun was the weapon used to kill Mr. Patterson, James realized with growing horror. The break-in hadn't been a random burglary. It had been Harold, young Harold, desperate for money to pay for Catherine's medical bills, choosing this house at random, breaking in, being surprised by the homeowner, making a split-second decision that had ended a life and haunted him forever. James looked up from the letters, and the apparition was still there, but calmer now, standing in the doorway of the spare bedroom, and the expression on its translucent face had changed from confusion to something like relief. The figure nodded slowly, just once, and then faded, dissolving into nothing, and James never saw it again. The footsteps stopped coming. The cold spots disappeared. The lights stayed off when he turned them off. The house became just a house. James called the police anonymously and told them where to find evidence related to an unsolved murder from 1978. He left the lockbox on the front porch with a note explaining what it contained, then drove to a hotel and waited. He read in the local news 2 weeks later that police had reopened the Patterson case, had identified Harold Marsh as the suspect based on anonymous tips and physical evidence. Case closed posthumously. Family finally had answers after more than 40 years. Mr. Patterson's daughter, now in her 60s, was quoted in the article saying she'd never stopped hoping for justice, never stopped believing her father's death would be solved, and knowing the truth, even this late, brought a measure of peace. James sold the house 3 months later, couldn't live there anymore, knowing what had happened, knowing he'd been sleeping above the ghost of a murderer, that every night he'd been listening to Harold relive his worst moment, the moment that defined and destroyed his entire life. The new owners got a good deal, same as James had, didn't believe in ghosts, thought the house's history was just story, not substance. James wonders sometimes if they hear the footsteps, if the haunting came back after he left, or if his solving the mystery really did lay the spirits to rest. He wonders if ghosts are just unfinished business, knots in the timeline that need to be untied before the dead can move on, or if there's something else, some residue of consciousness that lingers in places where strong emotions were felt. Trauma burned into the fabric of physical space. He lives in an apartment now, 20th floor of a modern building, all glass and steel and concrete, nothing old enough to hold ghosts, no history embedded in the walls. He sleeps fine most nights, dreamless, No footsteps climbing toward him in the dark. But sometimes, rarely, he'll wake at 3:47 a.m. exactly and feel a presence in the room, not threatening, just there, watching. And he'll wonder if Harold followed him somehow, if the ghost was never tied to the house, but to James himself, to the person who finally gave Harold what he'd wanted for decades, the chance to confess, to be known, to have his crime acknowledged and his punishment accepted. James doesn't mind if that's true, doesn't mind being haunted by Harold's ghost, because at least this ghost is quiet, keeps its distance, asks for nothing more than silent witness to its existence. The thing about ghosts is they're not always scary in the way you expect, not always malevolent entities bent on harm. Sometimes they're just sad, lost, carrying burdens they can't put down, looking for someone who can see them, acknowledge their pain, help them the closure they couldn't find in life. Harold's ghost showed James where the evidence was hidden, not to terrorize him, but to trust him, to finally tell the truth after 40 years of guilty silence. And in doing so, in revealing his crime, Harold freed himself and gave the Patterson family their long-denied justice, and James, for all the fear and sleepless nights, feels honored to have been part of that resolution, to have been the bridge between the living and the dead, the person who could see what needed to be seen and do what needed to be done. So which story disturbed you the most? Was it Marcus slipping between realities, never sure which version of his life was real? Sarah existing in quantum superposition, losing herself in infinite timelines? Or James living above the ghost of a murderer, listening to the echo of a decades-old crime? Drop a comment and let me know which one got under your skin, which one you'll still be thinking about tomorrow, which one will make you double, check your mirrors, or wonder about the sounds your house makes at night. And if these stories kept you engaged, if you made it all the way through, do me a favor and share this with someone who loves true scary stories, someone who appreciates the kind of horror that's subtle and psychological and makes you question the nature of reality itself. Share it with friends who listen to scary stories to fall asleep, who understand that sometimes the most disturbing tales are the ones that feel like they could actually happen, that blur the line between possible and impossible until you're not sure which side you're standing on.